Ashutosh is inside the Prime Minister's office, where the protesters have completely hijacked the Prime Minister's office at this point. Ashutosh, I'm throwing straight across to you. What do the protesters want and what's going on inside? If you could bring us up to speed with the latest developments.
Well, Chatty, this is what the protesters wanted after, the taking over the presidential palace, presidential secretariat, Prime Minister residence, Prime Minister's office, because this is where the Ranil Wickremesinghe has to work. And right after taking over as a working president of Sri Lanka, this was the anger amongst the people who were agitating that Ranil Wickremesinghe should not be made the president. And that exactly was the hours of the scuffle. And finally, they breached the security perimeter, and there was huge forces. There was special task force, there were policemen, armed policemen, and also the military. And if you see right in that hall, huge number of military persons are still sitting, and that is, we are inside where the Prime Minister holds meeting. This is the meeting area. Now you see, we just walk inside there, you see how the protesters entered. But it is way different than what had happened on 9th July, that protesters are in discipline. Though they breached it, they entered inside, but they are appealing each other not to touch public properties, not to destroy anything. And that is like, there you also see the STF and the police and army also, adjusting with these volunteers, these protesters, they allowing them to come inside, get pictures clicked, but nothing is being touched. No property has been destroyed at the Prime Minister's office. And this is what the Bar Council has been appealing. This is what the even protesters have been appealing. Their target was to take it over. Their target was to send out a message. It was a symbol of protest by these, because they have been always virtually protesting for 96 days. We'll just walk you outside how it looks like when the protesters reached. It's just been 20 minutes. They were all in a huge number outside, and now we are just taking you outside. Look at the number. Look at the strength of the armed personnel were deployed here. But despite all this power, despite all the strength, looks that the protesters overpowered them, because the numbers were not in 100, not in 1,000, but were in lakhs. The entire Colombo protest, if you remember those images, the drone captured images where lakhs of the protesters were seen at the Gulf face protest. They all started walking, and this was a spontaneous reaction. The moment they heard President has fled and Ranil Wickremesinghe could be the next president, this is what they put. These are the armed personnel. They were guarding the front line. There was firing in the air, multiple rounds through AK-47, multiple military-grade the tear shells were fired. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. Looks like they totally surrendered. But one thing I could really say, that army maintained the restraint. They did not fire upon the protesters. They did not use force on the protesters. The only aim was to disperse them, and hence the fire in the air and the tear shells were used on the protesters. But everything defeated by them. Looking at their huge number, that's the main gate where the national flag is flying. They are just shouting slogans. There's a huge crowd. We have seen the way people have been visiting.
Largely this protest has been absolutely peaceful. Ashutosh, would you say that?
It has been peaceful. It has been peaceful. They were walking on the road. In fact, when there were first round of tear shells were fired, I was along with the crowd. Then we heard the senior army general was talking to the protesters and convinced them, you are going somewhere, you are marching, march it peacefully, do not damage the public property. And people heard them, people loved them, they hugged the army personnel, even the army officials. And then they started marching towards the parliament. But suddenly they turned back to the Prime Minister's office, and at last they managed to reach here. No property has been damaged. There was only rounds of scuffle with the military personnel. This is how the protesters are, managing things, that there's a huge crowd. Everyone wants to go inside. Everyone wants to visit inside. They are allowing them one by one inside military personnel. Whatever objects are kept inside, preserved inside, being guarded by the military personnel, as a special task force, and also by these protesters, volunteers. So suddenly, the army and the same protesters who were engaged in a conflict, who were engaged almost in a virtual battle, of course not a really deadly violent battle, they all are now working together. It was very interesting to see when the army was pelting tear shells to the protesters, they were throwing it back to the army. When the civilians were injured, they had the eyes burning, the army personnel were giving them water. When they threw it back to the army, when army personnel were burning their eyes, it was the civilians who were helping the army personnel. This is a picture never seen in the democratic history of any country, and perhaps will never be seen. They know the battle is not against the army personnel, these army jawans, because they are their own family member, they are their own brother, sister, son. But it was a battle against a government. They were fighting against a government, and hence perhaps there was restraint, totally restraint maintained by the army forces. Several jawans also received injury, few nose broken, a few also scratches, and that's the kind of injuries they received. Look at this strength. This is the strength, and 10 times more than that, which were placed to guard the Prime Minister's office, but seems they totally protesters overpowered them. Many have received injuries. Now they all are planning to head back, as since there is no damage to the public properties. These protesters have been peaceful and maintaining a decorum, discipline, silently visiting, and all of them leaving back to the Gulf.
Right.